On Professor Sid Sondergaard's The Unconscious Structured Like a Comic Book, Reconstructive Psychology and Matthaus Bugtown Mythos. A critical review by the Spirit of Hegel, Part 1. In 1992, Professor Sid Sondergard of St. Lawrence University published The Unconscious Structured Like a Comic Book, Reconstructive Psychology and Matthaus Bugtown Mythos. Those Annoying Post Brothers and Savage Henry, written and illustrated by Matthaus, were a comic book series centering upon the escapades of a collection of characters living in Bugtown. In Bugtown, those who die through unnatural causes always regenerate after an indeterminate period of time, as the individuals they were prior to death. This really compels a reassessment of the social taboo against murder, and leads some characters, like the Annoying Post Brothers, Ron and Russ, to regard destruction, in particular of other living beings, as a creative act, an aesthetic endeavor. Hence, we often find characters in the series in the midst of the regeneration process. The presence of the kind of comic resurrection here that animates cultural systems as diverse as Christianity and Chuck Jones's Roadrunner cartoons is typical of the active intertextuality the artist-writer employs, says Sondergard. Intertextuality. The shaping of a text by another text, the essential element in a consideration of text as subject. Now, according to Lacan, the subject is defined as what the signifier represents, which should be understood in the following way. If the subject is a possibility of speech, and if this speech is actualized as a signifying chain, then the relation of a signifier to another signifier, or that which a signifier represents, as Lacan says, for another signifier, namely the very structure of the chain, is what must be named subject. Hence, these two definitions which compose the circle, where the logic of the signifier and the theory of the subject implicate each other. The signifier is what represents a subject for another signifier. The subject is what the signifier represents, and it is not able to represent anything but for another signifier. Now, Barth adds this to that idea. The writer can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others, in such a way as never to rest on any one of them. Did he wish to express himself, he ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. Sondergaard argues that as a hermeneutic model, Howe's Bugtown mythos affords an opportunity to look into in what way the reader as analyst deciphers meaning from the text as subject and narrative as dream, following Jacques Lacan's reading of Freud's interpretation of dreams in his argument that le rêve a la structure d'une phrase, ou plutôt d'un poème, c'est dire de écriture dans le rêve de l'enfant représenterait l'idéographe primordial, et qui, chez l'adulte, reproduit l'emploi phonétique et symbolique à la fois des éléments signifiants. En anglais, We must thus take up Freud's work, again starting with the Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams, to remind ourselves that a dream has the structure of a sentence, or rather, to keep to the letter of the work, of a rebus, that is, of a form of writing of which children's dreams are supposed to represent the primordial ideography, and which reproduces in adult dreams the simultaneously phonetic and symbolic use of signifying elements found in the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt and in the characters still used in China. That is from Lacan's Écrit. A rebus, as I'm sure you already know, is a representation of words or syllables by pictures or objects or by symbols whose names resemble the intended words or syllables in sound. Also, a riddle made up of such pictures or symbols. Can you see well? Lacan reads dream images as the signifiers of the language of the unconscious. Howarth, according to Sondergard, I'm stuck in French now, depicts a simultaneous confirmation and denial that the chains of pictorial and linguistic signifiers in his sequential art can be decoded as the rebus of the unconscious. The consciousness encoded in his comics is not any one individual's. As a response to issues that arise through readers about the ability of a number of Bugtown residents to shift from one reality to another at the speed of thought, Howarth has said that if one posits the existence of a virtually infinite array of alternate realities, time, space, enough for everything, then the concept of individualism is an absurdity. According to Lacan, the entirety of the dream thoughts in a given dream is taken as a network and is represented not at all term by term, but through a set of interlacings. In addition, he believes this to be Freud's fundamental premise in the interpretation of dreams, that the totality of meanings is represented by the totality of whatever is signifying. And further, toward decoding the rebus of the unconscious, Lacan says that the Freudian discovery leads us to hear in discourse this speech which reveals itself through or even in spite of the subject. So, to quote Lacan at length here, reread the beginning of the chapter on the dream work. A dream, Freud says, is a sentence. It is a rebus. Had it not been explicitly formulated by Freud, 50 pages of the interpretation of dreams would lead us to this equation just as easily. It would emerge just as well from the formidable discovery of condensation. You would be wrong to think that condensation simply means the term-by-term correspondence of a symbol with something. On the contrary, in a given dream, the whole of the dream thoughts, that is to say, the whole of those things signified, the meanings of the dream, is taken as a network and is represented, and not at all term by term, but through a set of interlacings. To demonstrate it to you, all I need to do is to take one of Freud's dreams and make a drawing on a blackboard, read the Traumdeutung, and you will see that really is how Freud understands it. The totality of meanings is represented by the totality of whatever is signifying. Each signifying element of the dream, each image, includes a reference to a whole set of things to be signified, and inversely, each thing to be signified is represented in several signifiers. So the Freudian discovery leads us to hear in the discourse this speech which reveals itself through or even in spite of the subject. Now, condensation in Freudian psychoanalysis. the process by which multiple unconscious thoughts, desires, or memories are compressed into a single image or idea within dreams, serving as a key mechanism in dream interpretation. Such revelatory speech is manifest as narrative, related either willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously, by the subject as narrator. But toward reconstructing and decoding the rebus of the unconscious, this narrative must be expanded to accommodate image text as well as speech text. For Bart, especially in cartoons and comic strips, words and images exist in a complementary relationship as the fragments of a more general syntagm, and the unity of the message is realized at a high level, that of the story. So to quote Bart here, anchorage is the most frequent function of the linguistic message and is commonly found in press photographs and advertisements. The function of relay is less common, at least as far as the fixed image is concerned. It can be seen particularly in cartoons and comic strips. Here, text, most often a snatch of dialogue, and image stand in a complementary relationship. The words, in the same way as the images, are fragments of a more general syntagm, and the unity of the message is realized at a high level, that of the story, the anecdote, the diegesis, which is ample confirmation that the diegesis must be treated as an autonomous system. Anchorage. The process by which linguistic elements, such as captions or titles, guide the interpretation of an image. It helps us to direct viewers toward a specific meaning by reducing ambiguity and controlling how the viewer perceives the image. Diegesis, which is just narrative, a style of fiction storytelling, in which a narrator describes the actions and thoughts of characters. Now, to quote from Sondergard's essay, working specifically with this story from those annoying Post Brothers, A Dead Time for Jerry, this essay examines how Mathauer's visual verbal narrative points both towards and away from the consciousness of the narrative proper, leads the reader into the constructed consciousness of the author, which is not the consciousness of Mathauer or specifically of anyone else, and provides a clarification of Lacan's network modeling of psychic structure, wherein image as signifier and language as signifier are explicitly encoded isomorphically rather than independently or diachronically. Just to explain some of that jargon, but I'm sure you know this already. Isomorphic, the same or similar in structure, form or shape. Diachronic, relating to the changes in something, especially a language, that happens over time. According to Lacan, regarding the logic of the signifier is constituted only from a synchronic and enumerable collection of elements, in which each is sustained only by the principle of its opposition to each of the others. This is Post Brothers 23. Dead Time for Jerry. Bart counters the latter portion of this assessment when discussing certain cartoons as images without words. The absence of the linguistic relay text always covers an enigmatic intention. That's a quote Bart. Today, at the level of mass communication, it appears that the linguistic message is indeed present in every image, as title, caption, accompanying press article, film dialogue, comic strip, balloon, which shows that it is not very accurate to talk of a civilization of the image. We are still, and more than ever, a civilization of writing. Writing and speech continuing to be the full terms of the informational structure. In fact, it is simply the presence of the linguistic message that counts, for neither its position nor its length seen to be pertinent. A long text may only comprise a single global signified, thanks to connotation, and it is this signified which is put in relation with the image. What are the functions of the linguistic message with regard to the twofold iconic message? There appears to be two, anchorage and relay. And that's Bart's footnote. Images without words can certainly be found in certain cartoons, but by way of a paradox, the absence of words always covers an enigmatic intention. Such absence is understood as replacement text rather than as opposition. The complexity of the comic panel as signifier can be established by reading the front cover of the Dead Time for Jerry issue of those annoying Post Brothers. The cover displays no spoken text, but there is a written text, a street sign that reads, Help keep Bugtown dangerous. It appears as the central portion of a triangular configuration of images. Two sides of this framed figure are determined by a personification of death, rather grotesquely enhanced by an eyeball hanging out of a skull socket. This sort of grotesqueness is why I just love Howard's comics, by the way. This is why I am doing this series, even though it's heavy work, because I am a fan. I should have pointed that out. Anyway, grotesquely enhanced by an eyeball hanging out of a skull socket, and by its iconographically conventional size, and the base is formed by the lifeless body of a woman's corpse, signified by the cranium which has been smashed open. The situational irony of a text appearing that cannot be read by a dead human or by a metaphysical personification indicates not only the opposition postulated by Lacan, but more importantly, into the enigma identified by Bart. The street sign communicates extra-textually to the reader as subject, in effect, commanding the reader to participate in Howard's mythos by opening the comic's cover and thereby to help keep Bugtown dangerous. The author desires the text's engagement by the reader, and this engagement has been called full speech by Lacan. So to quote Lacan, we have been led to emphasize that aspect of resistance which is to be located at the very level of the utterance of speech. Speech can express the being of the subject, but up to a certain point. It never succeeds in so doing. So we have now reached the point where we ask ourselves the question, in relation to speech, how should one locate all of these affects, all these imaginary references, which are ordinarily invoked when one wants to define the action of the transference in the analytic experience? You have clearly perceived that it is not a matter of course. Full speech is speech which aims at, which forms the truth such as it becomes established in the recognition of one person by another. Full speech is speech which performs one of the subjects finds himself afterwards other than he was before. That is why this dimension cannot be evaded in the analytic experience. But Lacan insists that the analyst who desires to attain full speech with the subject must follow a path leading in the diametrically opposed direction, insofar as it instructs the subject to delineate a speech as devoid as possible of any assumption of responsibility, and that it even frees him or her from any expectation of authenticity. So, to quote from Lacan at length, we cannot think of the analytic experience as a game, a lure, an intrigue based on an illusion, a suggestion. Its stake is full speech. Once this point has been made, as you might have already noticed, lots of things sort themselves out and are clarified, but lots of paradoxes and contradictions appear. The value of this conception is precisely to bring out those paradoxes and contradictions, which doesn't make them opacities and obscurities. On the contrary, it is often what appears to be harmonious and comprehensible which harbours some opacity, and inversely it is the antinomy in the gap, in the difficulty, that we happen upon opportunities for transparency. This is the point of view on which our method is founded, and so, I hope, is our progress. The first of the contradictions to appear is the remarkable fact that the analytical method, if it aims at attaining full speech, starts off on a path leading in a diametrically opposed direction, insofar as it instructs the subject to delineate a speech as devoid as possible of any assumption of responsibility, and that it even frees him from any expectation of authenticity. It calls on him to say everything that comes into his head. It is through these very means that it facilitates, that is the least one can say, his return onto the path which, in speech, is below the level of recognition and concerns the third party, the object. So, the reader of Dead Time for Jerry begins the narrative in precisely the manner, in order to initiate and follow, a sequence of 5 deaths and resurrections involving Jerry Cale, who has just recently married the most dangerous man alive. That's Ron Post, who confirmed this title by killing each of the other Ron Posts from the infinite array of alternative reality levels with a spatula, which he proudly identifies as a common household kitchen utensil, and which Ron begins the story as dead, yes. Howe's narration for the opening panel, which features Jerry sprawled face down in a pool of her own blood, and with part of her brain exposed, reads, "The bad news is that someone shot Jerry in the back of the head, killing her instantly. She died in Bugtown. Depending on how you look at it, this is also the good news." This first encounter requires no assumption of responsibility on the part of the reader, analyst, who has yet to meet Jerry Cale, or of Jerry herself as subject, and the description of the regenerative process Jerry is undergoing, shredded muscles read it, ruptured blood vessels reconnect, etc., quickly makes the narrative's science fictions explicit, removing any expectation of authenticity or verisimilitude. Guided then by the actualizing goal of full speech, as the speech which performs, yet presented with the disjunctive signifier of Jerry Cale's corpse, the reader-analyst is quickly led into the manifest content of the dream narrative which occupies Jerry's psyche, while her body reconstructs itself. As the narrative's consciousness, which may or may not be Jerry's own, declares, however, the brain does some weird shit when it's repairing itself. Disjointed memories and delusions interweave in a very hazy darkness. Commenting, I'm quoting again from Lacan here, commenting on the text is like doing an analysis. How many times have I said to those under my supervision, when they say to me, "I had the impression he meant this or that one of the things we must guard most against is to understand too much, to understand more than what is in the discourse of the subject. To interpret and to imagine, one understands, are not at all the same things. It is precisely the opposite. I would go as far as to say that it is on the basis of a kind of refusal of understanding that we push open the door to analytic understanding. But in spite of Lacan's cautions against uncovering more than what is in the discourse of the subject, because to interpret and to imagine are not at all the same things, the reader-analyst may reasonably begin speculating on what anxieties, signified by disjointed memories and delusions, have been repressed and hence excluded from or disguised in the dream narrative. The positioning of Jerry as dreamer at first suggests that the discourse of the subject will be her dream. But if one reads her as a subject of the narrative discourse, rather than as the subject from which the discourse is derived, a semantic system of the kind shown in Figure 1 can be opened. A semiotic of induction, which begins at the level of a subject narrative, reads backward from there to its poly-ideological sources as subject, and finally arrives at a hermeneutic metastructure which demonstrates how the unconscious can be read through the rebus it encodes. And this is Figure 1 in Sondergard's essay. I shall go through it in more detail next time.